Very briefly, who am I? My name is Maggie Cassidy. I've been the editor of the Valley News since just before the turn of the year. I live across the river in White River Junction. I've lived in the Upper Valley for 7 years, and I moved here for the Valley News from Hawaii in January. At the time, before I was working at the Valley News, I was working at a very small newspaper in Hawaii. We as the only reporter, we took out the trash, we delivered the newspapers, we wrote the stories, did it all. Before that, I did a couple internships at the Boston Globe through Northeastern University's co-op program, where you go to school and then you work full-time and go to school, work full-time. I got the full journalism experience very early on when I was essentially laid off from my internship because during a period of reorganization and buyouts, they cut my section from the newspaper while I was interning there. And welcome to the world of journalism very early on. At the same time, I was also working on the student newspaper and had similar experience. The administration was not friendly in terms of the articles that we were producing, and in order to try to protect what we were doing in terms of being able to report as honestly as we could, we moved the whole newspaper off campus and we started a nonprofit, and we were publishing the paper, and it's like this really cool thing, and we timed it perfectly for the financial crisis to hit, and all of our advertisers pulled out, and we couldn't keep the lights on, and that was just like this is like a theme that is going to come out of this day, is just turbulence in the world of journalism. Before that, worked at a paper for a short time in the sports department where my dad had worked, so very familiar with his trials and tribulations at that newspaper as well. So, so that's a little bit about me. The Valley News. The Valley News has been around since 1952, originally in the building on Route 10. That's now the Allers Furniture building. And I think that, Dan, is this correct? We've been in behind McDonald's since the 80s? Does that sound right?
The 70s.
The 70s, okay. We're still there. A lot of people have been asking my colleagues and me, how's our new offices in Concord? We are still in West Lebanon, we're not in Concord. We moved our press to Concord, to the village of Pennacook in Concord, but you know, my colleagues and myself in the newsroom, and then our colleagues in advertising and customer service are all still in West Lebanon. We publish every day except for Christmas. We have a staff of, I think it's 21 right now, a little more than 20 people working in the newsroom. So that's reporters, editors, photographers. And that's down quite a bit since I started working there. I think the number was probably closer to 30 when I started working there 7 years ago. The newsroom is broken down into, let's count them, 5 departments. So news, sports, features, opinion, and photo. And so each one of those departments has an editor. And most of them have a small staff working for them, and that's kind of how you know, how the structure of the newsroom, how things sort of come together every day. Just a little bit about a typical day at the Valley News newsroom. I have talked to friends who think all different kinds of things happen at the Valley News in terms of how we start with truly nothing day after day and work into a paper. They think that robots are involved in a lot more processes than they actually are involved in, and have all kinds of ideas. So here's the quick rundown. Folks show up around 9 o'clock. Hopefully they know what they're working on if they're good. Tim knows that the best defense is a good offense, so if you don't want to be working on a boring story, then your best bet is to have a better story in the hopper waiting to go. They're checking in with the news editor is checking in with me. You know, what are we going to cover, in what ways are we going to cover it, how much time are we going to spend on it, stuff like that. New for us in the past few months is we meet at noon and talk about what's going to be in the next day's paper. Previously, that meeting was happening closer to 5, but because of the new press that I mentioned that we have in Pennacook, that has moved up all of our deadlines in terms of when we send the pages to the printer, and so we've moved everything up. So a noon meeting as opposed to a 5 o'clock meeting. Then reporters are working, Tim's still working the phones, hitting the street. Photographers are out, hopefully they're working closely with reporters. We have another meeting at 3:30, and that's where these budgets really start to come into play. So our news editor has his budget in terms of what Tim has been working on and what the rest of the staff has been working on. The desk editors have come in and looked at the Associated Press and the Washington Post and our other wires and looking at what they have available. And then everybody gets into a room, well, 4 people get into a room and say, this is what I think should be on A1, this doesn't belong in our paper at all, et cetera, and kind of make their case for what they think should be where. And then one of the more visible things that I do is make those decisions for most days in terms of what's actually going to be out there on the front. Hopefully folks are filing by 6 or so, and then these days we're putting the whole paper to bed by 10. So between 4 o'clock and 10, the desk editors are pulling stories off of those wires. They're working with the reporters to edit copy. They are looking at photos and laying out pages and rearranging things, trying to catch typos, trying to write headlines, which is a real weak point of mine. It's really hard to write headlines, and getting all of that done by 10 o'clock. Used to be midnight, now it's 10 o'clock, so that gives a sense of the difference that we're working in these past few months. And that's kind of a typical day at the Valley News. Did I miss anything?
No, I think that's pretty much it.
Okay. So that's kind of the extent of the spiel on the sort of like, who am I and what's the Valley News. Want to just touch on why I'm here, and then get into why I'm here and sort of the challenges and goals for the Valley News, and then get into some of this discussion. So the why I'm here. Part of my hope and part of what I wanted to do when I took the job late last year was to be a little bit more deliberate in our interactions with the public. Instead of reaching out just when it's time for a story or waiting for folks to come to us, try to put ourselves out there a little bit more and talk to people. There are a few reasons for that. I think the Upper Valley is, of course, bigger than it was, and it's a little bit more transient than it used to be. And the role of newspapers and homes has really changed, and the role of news in general has really changed. So I don't think that it's, I don't think that we can take for granted that people understand what we do or understand what we see as our reasons for what we do, or why we're doing it, how we do it, how things work, et cetera. So just trying to make myself available to talk about some of those things and see if folks have questions and things like that. There's a lot of talk in the journalism industry about using the web for engagement, but I still think that face-to-face is pretty great. So just trying to spend time on that. And then the last sort of main reason is, I talked about where I come from and sort of underscored the turbulence, because that is kind of the theme of the industry, is things are really hard right now. And that's very clear to folks working in journalism. It's our lives. We think about it all day, every day. And when I talk to people about it who don't work in journalism, who don't have, aren't sort of just swimming in it all day, a lot of times people are really surprised and aren't thinking just about that in the same way that we are. I mean, why would they? And I think the more dangerous part is aren't thinking about, okay, well, if not my local newspaper, then what? Or what do I want local news to be? Or what does it mean to get news from this or that source, and sort of media literacy questions and things like that. So that's the hope. The challenges that the Valley News faces right now are largely around budget. Trying to figure out how to continue to do what we do, or how do we need to change what we need to do with a budget that every year that I've been at the Valley News has been a smaller budget than the year prior. And also we have not only a smaller budget, which is to say fewer people, but we have a huge range of ways to tell stories that we didn't have before. We have the internet in terms of the speed and pacing of news is a completely different ballgame than, pick a time for us, 1 year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Video, how much time and energy do we spend on video? Podcasts, how much time and energy do we spend on podcasts? Other sort of online infographics and things like that. So we have fewer resources and more options, and so that's kind of the ball game, is what kind of decisions do we make as a newsroom, and what does the community want to see out of us in terms of how we make those decisions. So that's kind of the broad challenge, and the goals are essentially figuring it all out. So the goal for me is not only for the Valley News to survive, but the goal is for the Valley News to thrive. The goal is not just to be thinking about 2019, but the goal is to be thinking about 2025 and 2030. And that can feel really hard when things are as turbulent as they are. But I think that what the Valley News does is really important. And even if it's not the Valley News, I think that local news is really important. The Valley News is the vehicle that I have for it. So that's just kind of where my head is at. Is that enough talking at you guys? So I gave you a hint already in terms of some of the things that I was hoping to get a discussion going about. Where you get your news, what is local news to you, what's missing from local news, what do you want it to be, and what would it mean to you if it was missing? And then just broadly, more like space for questions, like ask me whatever you want kind of thing. So I think where we'll start is where you get your news, what does local news mean to you, and where do you get it?
I don't understand what you mean by budget.
Oh, that's a good question.
Like space, words?
No, that's a really good question. So news. So we're dealing with. I'm dealing with a financial budget, obviously. So that's kind of what I'm talking about in terms of budget challenges. But then a news budget is just like a lineup of stories that are for consideration. So the local news editor develops his daily budget, and it will say, I'm expecting that this story is going to be 15 inches long or 30 inches long. Inches being the inch count in the paper is how we measure stories. And then we have the AP budget, we have the Washington Post budget, so it's just kind of jargon for a list of stories that are available to us. Yeah?
You've mentioned local news a number of times. I get almost all of my news through the paper, sitting down and including the crossword. I'm hoping that the percent of the paper that's local news never goes up. I mean, it's important to me. I'm a teacher. I'm tied in with the community. In fact, I run the Upper Valley Math Club in the conference room tomorrow and that kind of thing. So it's important to know that. But I really would like to see more in terms of the Washington Post, the LA Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, that kind of thing. Hardcore news that's not politics. The political situation is still a year away and so forth. So boiling it down, I do think local news is very important, but positively never higher percentage than it is now. And I love the Valley News. We moved here in '94. I've gotten it every day since. However, I'm not sure that we need to see large pictures of cows on the front page. I think it's kind of unclassy to write a letter to the editor about that. So I'm not that small. I'm not gonna do that silliness. But perhaps some of that space could be put off to another article. I really, really would love to see substantive news from afar. That's terribly important. And you know that there are problems, and without getting into politics, because you know this can slide into politics, but we need more substantive news. So.
Yeah, no, you exactly hit on one of the difficult calculations that I try to make every day in terms of not necessarily the overall percentage of, we think of it as world nation versus local region. So not necessarily how much of it fits into the paper, but where it fits. So, you know, folks who have read the Valley News for a long time might be noticing these past few months that the front page feels a lot more local, I think, than it did previously. And so the hope is that longtime loyal readers who have been with the Valley News and understand that that's something that we can bring to the table, is we can be a sort of one-stop shop in terms of, you know, your neighborhood, your town, your region, your country, your world, that's really valuable, and that's important. But in terms of the front, trying to grab new readers who have not been with the Valley News, who say, I heard about that on my phone, you know, yesterday morning. I get my World Nation news somewhere else. I'm not looking for a one-stop shop yet because I'm not that kind of reader. And trying to say, let me showcase stories that you truly can't get anywhere else. I mean, there's just nobody else doing the really local, and just hope that readers such as yourself will sort of flip the page and say, okay, I know that I can still get my World Nation. It might not be above the fold in the same way. Some of it might not be on the front, but it's tricky because I hear all sides of it in terms of the local balance and the World Nation.
Since the paper is condensed
Yeah.
and so on and so forth, and I am a math teacher, so I
Yeah.
see the mathematics of all of
Yeah,
this.
no.
My feel is that there is less news, and I could be wrong on that. I think some of the letters to the editor have expressed that, sometimes in an unkind way, and I don't want to put it in an unkind way, but my gut feeling is that there is less news, less. Again, I need substantive news. This
Yeah.
is where I get my news.
No, I understand. I don't think there's any way for me to make the case that we have shrunk the paper by such and such a margin and have maintained the exact number of written words. That certainly isn't the case. What we've tried to do is we had a course that Tim can attest to on writing shorter, writing more concisely. We're trying to be more concise in our World Nation coverage as well. And there are some design functions in terms of the way that we're designing the pages and the fonts and things like that, so it's not like we took the same design and, you know, sort of lopped it off, but it's also not like we have the same exact amount of news. So it's difficult. I mean, we try to write really short now because of these changes. Yeah.
So to make this even more controversial,
Sure.
I have to respectfully disagree. You know, I get the newspaper because I want to hear what's going on locally. Having lived in D.C. for 15 years, I go online. I could read the Washington Post. I go online. I could read the New York Times. I don't think you can do it justice to put it in our newspaper. I get our newspapers so I can see what's going on locally. You know, it's not just in this area, but all the way up to Burlington, southern New Hampshire. So I can see it's a controversial topic.
Well, I mean, and as I said, so with, you know, this little news budget, if folks participate in the exercise, there's no right or wrong answers. There's some answers that are pretty wrong, but there are a lot of ways to lay out a front page that are legitimate. I think the, you know, the, so what you're saying is along the lines of what I'm thinking, right? In terms of, if I already got my World Nation news somewhere else, what do I need the Valley News for? So one of the things that we're trying to do also that is not necessarily new to me, but I'm still trying to work in that direction, is what can the Valley News bring to the table with some of these really big news stories that maybe you didn't get on your phone at first when it happened. So that would be a much more in-depth piece, a broader look piece, an analysis, things like that. And the other case that I try to make to people in terms of flipping into World Nation is, you know, your phone is great for keeping on top of breaking news as it's happening. I'm the former web editor at the paper. You know, I like breaking news. I like digital and all that. But in terms of sitting down with the print edition and looking at the hierarchy of a page and looking at sort of slow reading the news, I'm still a big fan of that. And I still think that that's something that if you have one paper that has everything from what's happening, you know, at Kilton Library to what's happening in Iran, then I think there's value to that too.
I agree that the local news is very important. And I love the cows. But I really think that I've noticed changes as you've been there a while, and even changes to the layout as the experimentation was going on with the other printing source. But, you know, the Valley News, which I've taken since 1980, has had a great reputation. And I'm always very proud to hear people who used to work for the New York Times say, I moved up here and I love the Valley News. They think it's a good paper. I've also noticed when I go to my kids out in San Francisco area or some other affluent place, the paper is lousy. It's just like an advertiser, you know, a little advertiser with very little meat to it at all. So I think that the Valley News is really important to me, and I read it every morning. So I'm supposed to walk down to Danowitz and get it, but what happened was winter came, and now I go out my door and there's a basket right there. So there it is, ready for coffee.
Perfect. So let me ask you, so when you go out and visit and there are papers that are feeling a little thin, you know, not necessarily just physically, but in terms of the substance of the news and stuff like that. What do you think is missing in terms of what kind of impact does that have on that community?
Well, I think, well, you have a terrific calendar. That's very important to me, to be able to look in the calendar and just see what's going on, like why I'm here. And also, I've noticed that you, with your calendar person, have started having subdivisions like the senior page and things like that are great. And I personally like to read the letters to the editor, because I think we're in an area where you can get some very interesting points of view. Also, who writes the editorials? Is that, you get that from another source, or do you write it, or?
So any of the editorials that are unsigned are written by the Valley News. And if they have the name of another paper, the Chicago Tribune, et cetera, then we've gotten it from that paper. Dan used to write some editorials before he retired, and now there are 2 people who write editorials, and they represent the view of the editorial board, which is a group of 4 people currently, including myself.
So to the point over there, I heard another complaint. I think it was in the letters to the editor, and it said, probably by someone who wasn't as liberal, but he said, if I wanted the Washington Post, I'd subscribe. So they didn't like the fact that the news was coming from other sources. But I think it's very important. It makes a really nice balance in the paper. Do you want to talk?
Thank you. Some of this I've been thinking about for decades, literally. Probably about 30 years ago, I was walking home from work one day, and I saw a body lying in the street, and the ambulance arrived as I was going past, so I knew the person was being attended to. But I didn't find out for several weeks that it was somebody I knew. There was nothing in the paper. I'm from an area that in many ways is like the Upper Valley, a number of towns within a certain distance. We had a remarkably good paper, and the community up the road had another paper. One was morning, one was afternoon, and the area seemed to support both of them. And I know the one that we read, which was the afternoon one, you had some predictability of what would turn up for which communities, which I liked. And I've thought about that, whether it would work here, and I don't think it would. I think it would be kind of sham. It would not, it wouldn't unfold organically, whereas it did in that area in a different era. I do really like having local information. I find that I'm not, you couldn't pay me to read on a smartphone, but I find that in the morning I'm seeing a lot of what I've heard on the PBS NewsHour the night before. And does that bother me? Not really. It just gets me through the paper a little faster. Or if I feel like rereading it, I can. But I like having what's going on in this region. And I also am outright a newspaper junkie. I'm from a book world, so the fact that I'm attuned to the printed word is built into me. But I love papers. I also read the Globe on Sunday. About half the time, I have a mail subscription to a 6 days a week Massachusetts paper other than the Globe. I'm off right now, but I've been on for probably 9 months before I just came back off. So I already was familiar with the new sheet size. I don't mind it. I do mind the way the crossword puzzle folds, but you know, I see how other areas, particularly that one that I subscribe to some of the time and I don't, how they handle regional and local news. I think there's more of it. I'm very happy that you have Gina Barreca at the moment. I can never pronounce Admiral, I can't say his last name, but I'm glad to see him turning up. I like it when there's a locally written piece too. I think you used to have more local op-ed pieces. I'm going back probably a while, but
Yeah, possibly, although I think it's part of, I mean, we didn't have a Sunday paper years ago, and a lot of it's put into the Sunday paper, and that's a bit of a change. I guess that's probably some of what happened.
But, I cheer you on. You know, I actually have anxiety about your print ad budgets sometimes. You know, are you getting enough, people.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
advertising is tough. Yeah.
So, anyway, but I think good things are happening. I just pray that it continues. Yeah.
Hi, I'm also a huge fan and don't take the paper for granted at all because I lived in Los Angeles for a long time and saw that paper disappear section by section and reporter by reporter. And, I'm thinking, I have so much I want to say, but I guess I want to stick with your idea of what's local news and say that I really, really, really have noticed a change since you switched to the location of your printers. And in that now when I read the paper, I've already read every story that's not local. I've heard it, I've seen it pretty much, unless it's something really quirky. Because I am a scroller. I'll scroll through the New York Times several times a day. So that said, to me, it's just a massive opportunity to drill down locally because every story here is national. It's just the nation doesn't know it. And some of your writers are writing at such a beautiful quality. That was a national story when the Dartmouth psychiatry professors, right? That was a national story. But the only reporter who wrote about it, and what was the name of the woman who did most of those stories?
Nora Doyle.
Yeah, the only reporter in the country, print, media, anything, who wrote about what the women wanted in terms of structural change, as opposed to, what they wanted structurally to change at a university for all students, and in that structure of having mentors. And so that was brilliant. That's a national story. She's the only person who wrote it from that angle that I could see. This trend we're having right now where we don't really have that macro story yet in the Valley News, but you've written about the man in Orford who paid off the lunch debt. You've written about Claremont having a collections agency go after parents who didn't pay their lunch debt. And now now you have this story about the lunch workers, the food service workers in Mascoma, which, as far as I can tell from reading your paper, started as a letter to the editor. Didn't that story start?
I think that's right.
Yeah, some citizen, which is another reason I love the Valley News. So citizens are writing in, citizens meaning everyone who lives here or visits here. People are writing in and generating real conversations among the community. So that's a macro story about hunger and children, right? That's a national story. You're telling it in a very specific way. With a beautiful cow on the front page to get everybody to open the paper. No, so I don't know. I guess I respectfully disagree with this gentleman, but I think it's only because we're getting our news in different sources that I just say, let's go more local and let's do it. Let's keep doing it this really high quality, and let's have some of the, there's some really large stories that I feel like we didn't cover in the Upper Valley around the Affordable Health Care Act and what was happening in New Hampshire when we were one of those states that lost our insurance companies a couple of years into the, I think this affects everyone in the nation. It's just, here's a really good place to look at it all. And I do really love the way you curate the news where I love that there's something from the outside magazine, and I do like the stories you're picking from these other sources, but I don't understand how much it costs to have a book review come from another source versus having a local person write a book review, or why aren't we having more local writers writing these stories which are, that's what I want. So you're saying it's because of a budget issue?
Yeah, we don't have that many writers.
Well, so to your question in terms of the expenses of a wire versus a local person, a wire is a lot of bang for your buck. Wires are very expensive, but to put it in perspective, I think everything that we spend on all of our news wires is roughly what we would spend on one sort of mid-level person. So, but,
Another employee.
no, I understand what you're saying though, but so for freelancers is obviously another ballgame, but to give a sense of how much we spend on wires. And then in terms of freelancers, yeah, we have a freelance budget too, and it goes down every year. But I understand what you're saying in terms of we're lucky to live in an area with a lot of very talented people who, you know, can write a lot of these things, but the budget comes back and remains an issue. The other thing that you touched on that I think is spot on in terms of what local news can do, not just the Valley News, but local news in general, is to either localize stories that start off as national or to be the root of stories that start off local and become national. So any of the examples that you mentioned.
Also just that, I mean, just this position of all these candidates coming, I mean, it's astounding to me, the change in 4 years that every candidate is now going to headrest. They're going and meeting with, you know, a substance use treatment facility. That's, you know, we've never seen that kind of interaction of a candidate with any kind of public health issue. They didn't go to an HIV clinic. They didn't go to a homeless shelter.
Yeah.
And that's happening right here ahead of the rest of the country.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm going to keep that in the back of my head. Yeah, so when on that local versus national thing, the only other thing I want to say on that is one of the questions that I had was, you know, what is local news to you? Because I think that does mean different things to different people. When the conversation is happening nationally about the impacts to local news and we got to save local news, a lot of times those conversations are happening around places like the Boston Globe, which is a great paper, like the Sacramento Bee, like the Houston Chronicle, which are all great papers and should be saved. But they're sort of operating on a different plane than the Valley News is in terms of the amount of resources that they have. And the conversation that I see tends to forget, you know, so when the Globe does their version of the Dartmouth PBS story, or if the Globe were to do, you know, a school lunch, you know, look at the gap between what's, you know, school districts are able to pay for school lunches versus parents versus who picks up the tab, whatever. Or if the Post or the New York Times were to do that story, like all of those start as, you know, either Valley News stories or even, you know, Vermont Standard, Randolph Herald, Journal Opinion, you know, much smaller papers than ours. And so I just flag that as like, you know, I agree with what you're saying, essentially, that every story, you know, can be like the root of a much bigger story, or we can take these stories and localize them in a way that makes them very directly relevant to our immediate communities.
I didn't totally understand what you're saying. You're saying that all of those national stories are starting as stories they pick up from...
Yeah, I mean, not every single story. I mean, certainly like a story in the White House probably would not, but you know, when a healthcare reporter for the New York Times is trying to figure out what's going on in the healthcare world, you know, in addition to working sources and keeping up with, you know, academic journals and all that, like, I expect that they're also reading local news. And so, you know, they're reading the Globe, they're reading other sort of metro level papers. Where are those metro level papers getting their, you know, stories from? A lot of times their ideas for stories are looking at disparate stories in small communities outside of their region. And so there's this feeder system from like the very small weeklies up to the sort of mid-sized papers, up to the metro papers, up to the Times. So, you know, the New York Times and the Washington Post have found this scale to figure out how to sustain themselves in the digital age. But part of the conversation that I think is missing is, so if we don't have local news that as part of that ecosystem, what happens to the stories that, these big players see. I think that they start to, right, so like we're like, whatever you want to call us, I don't mind, like we're a little guppy, whatever. Compared to the New York Times, we're certainly very, very small. And the impact of having these news deserts, so to speak, so regions where there is no longer a dedicated news source, whether it's a paper or whatever, is impacted on it makes an impact on the community. But another thing that we start to lose more broadly is the ability to see that bigger story, so that national story that you're talking about.
I've read the Valley News for decades and love it as the source of local information. What you have that none of the other big papers have is local, and I hope that the idea of buying local and focusing on local will stay, because I think it would be a huge loss if we didn't have that. And I can understand that you can't compete with the media, the big media, and that's okay. Lots of us, I think, read other newspapers, probably mostly online now. We can't subscribe to all of them. And isn't the question how to keep the Valley News vibrantly local? I admire many of the things that you do. Where I go first often is letters to the editor. I find them really interesting. And I really am curious to know a little more about what I think is a board of writers. I guess they're freelancers, retired journalists from elsewhere. Can you tell me a little more about that? I'm thinking of Jonathan Stapleford, and there's some others in there. Can you tell me anything about that?
Dan might actually be able to say a little bit about how, I'm not sure where we originally found many of our writers for the opinion pages.
I would say a lot of them came to us through the years. These are people with some experience and background in either writing or publishing. It's only some of them who've stayed. Jonathan Stapleford, Willem Lang is probably the most, has the most staying power. That kind of work is kind of a labor of love for those folks, and they often want to do it. It would only be a small part of somebody's income. So these are people that really want to do it and want to do it for a long time. We've had a lot of people. I ran the opinion page, and I worked on the for a time in the features section. There's a lot of folks that have a couple good stories in them or a couple good columns in them, but the people that can do it for a long time they have to be pros. So they've all mostly come to the Valley News. I think we've reached out to a few people too, when new people move and we think they might be interested in.
Thanks, Dan.
I'm groping about how to ask a question about how you define what is local, because that can fall into ruts of the big elephant in the middle of the room. You know, Dartmouth Hitchcock are certainly local, but you can get kind of sick of reading about them, whereas somebody in downtown Woodstock may say, what about us? So how do you find that balance?
That's a good question. I think especially with Dartmouth, trying to find stories that are of interest to not only a current student or an alumnus, but have some sort of impact on the broader Upper Valley, or at least the town, because otherwise it can feel pretty Dartmouth-centric if the story itself doesn't have a lot of reach. So I'm trying to think of an example. there was some situation at Dartmouth in the past few years, and I think that we did end up doing a story just because it seemed to be pretty unusual, but like heat went out in a building or something like that, and they were trying to figure out what to do and where to put students. And so it's like, you know, how much reach does this story have? Does this really impact, you know, your average reader? Is this like a very Dartmouth campus story? So like that's one of the considerations for Dartmouth. And I think that you could basically apply that, some version of that metric to just about any, you know, group that we cover. So DHMC or, you know, select boards, police departments, businesses even, is looking at the story on its merits and keeping the readers. Our news editor is really good at saying, what about the reader? So what is the reader gonna, is the reader gonna understand this sentence if we write it this way? How does the story impact this reader's life, et cetera? I think that's how you try to avoid going too heavy into any one, you know, subject. But that's generally always a balance. You know, we cover 46 towns, which is a big number, and so if there's something happening, you know, just outside the border of our coverage area, that sort of metric comes back into play on what are the merits of this story for the core of our readership. Is it kind of an in-town scuffle, or does it have broader implications, or is it just that interesting that, you know, that people on the other side of the Upper Valley would want to read it? So it's a balancing act. Does that kind of answer the question? Yeah.
But I'm reading the newspaper, your newspaper too, not just so that you'll reach me, but that's so you'll expand my reach.
Right.
So it's this idea of what is local in terms of, you know, not just geography and not just our main employers or whatever, but what class, you know, are we covering across class? Are we covering across migration? Are we covering across gender? You know, all of that stuff. And I just think that's super important to put in the balance.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Part of, oh, sorry, go.
I just thought from my years, I mean, all the people that work at the Valley News, the reporters and even the ad people sort of have their ears open about things they hear about when they're out and about, and that's a big source of where they hear about local things. Probably some of the people at the Valley News would look at listservs, they'd look at weekly newspapers. Sometimes people call occasionally who feel aggrieved by something, and so basically the people that work there they have their antenna open all the time. And sometimes you look at national stories and wonder, as you're talking about something like immigration, you start to think, like, where can we do a local version of that story and tell where the story has impact here?
And I think also one of the things that I've picked up over my time working there, one of the sort of driving forces is to knit the Upper Valley together. So bringing, you know, even if it didn't happen in your town, is it of interest to you, or how can it be of interest to you? Like, what is the bigger picture that would be of interest to you? How can we broaden it out? And kind of creating the region in terms of what is the Upper Valley. I think the Valley News has a role to play in that. My recollection of the history of the Valley News is that the Valley News had something to do with naming the Upper Valley the Upper Valley.
I read that, but I read it in the Valley News.
Yeah, right. Me too.
Somebody cynically said it was wherever we could sell newspapers.
Right. So that's how it started. But I mean, now it has. You know, you can define the region through the Valley News, but through a number of other things. And to what extent exactly the Valley News played a role in defining that region, besides giving it a name, you know, I don't want to overstate it. But part of the idea is to sort of bring you together in this area as your home beyond your neighborhood or your town.
Do you have guidelines or rules as far as each section, how much is dedicated to local versus national or international?
Yeah,
Is it vary from day to day, or who makes that decision?
We don't have rules. A lot of it is driven by advertising, which drives page layout, which drives what pages are going to be what. So that doesn't necessarily drive the percentage of we're going to have this many, world nation stories, this many, twin state stories, et cetera. But it would make the difference between do we have a full world nation page or not? Or are we going to have world nation stories throughout the A section, but we don't have a full open page to do only world nation? But in general, I mean, the rule of thumb as it was described to me when I started, we used to much more frequently do a 6-story front in the bigger layout. And it was something like, 3 local stories, maybe 2 or 3 local stories, 1 or 2, state stories, Vermont, New Hampshire, and then more like 1 or 2 world nation stories. And the mix was obviously a little bit different than the way that I've been trying to arrange them. So I still am often trying to get at least 1 of each on the front and trying to hold that balance throughout the paper, but I'm often doing a 4-story front now as opposed to a 6. So that changes that, and then it has a sort of trickle-down effect in terms of what shows up in the rest of the section.
Yeah, so one thing I think is so difficult is for a paper of your size is you're covering 2 states, right? So so I'll often read the headline. I'll be like, we did what? And then I like, oh, it says the New Hampshire state. I was like, oh, okay. Right. So we didn't do that. Right. They did that across the river. Right. But so just to say again, like, what a great job I think you do. And do you guys apply for grants, like to big foundations to like help boost your? And there seems to be this trend for grant-funded journalism. Yeah. Is that something you all have done?
Yeah. So I know that we have a few times in the past before me, and I just submitted one a couple weeks ago as well. It does kind of go back full circle to the conversation about what is local news. That's one of the times where the conversation about what is local news drives me nuts, because these grants are often geared toward like the dividing line, like what division do you fall in for a newspaper grant, is Division A is you're in one of the top 10 biggest cities in the country, or your coverage area is 1 million people or more. Division B is everybody else. And it's like, we qualify, like we so qualify for like having fewer than 1 million people in our coverage area. And so that puts us up against like really big papers for a really small number of grants that are for limited time frames for specific projects. So that sounds really Debbie Downer. I don't mean to be that Debbie Downer, because it is something that I'm interested in and am, continuing to apply for. But, and I do think that, so I'm interested in, I have been researching and interested in learning more about journalism trusts and journalism nonprofits, and that is sort of a big piece of the conversation broadly right now. My worry is, between now and when we get out of the next recession. So there's going to be another one, and then at the other end of that, how many local papers are still going to be around, and what role can trusts with sort of limited power play to how many of these papers are going to get carried through things like trusts and things like that. I mean, that's like really where my mind is at a lot of the time. And so yeah, it's something that I still am interested in and am researching, but I don't know if it's going to be like the whole answer to how local news survives, or if it's going to be part of it or what. But I do think something has to help carry papers through a little bit to the next sustainable business model.
I have been surprised at some of the things that I've learned more broadly by things that were written about the Valley News specifically. I think the first time this happened was a piece about the effect of tariffs on newsprint affecting the Valley News. I had no clue about that. It has plugged me into everything I've read about tariffs subsequently very differently. You know, if that hadn't been shared, I would be the poorer for it. And I think in general, while I suppose the pendulum could go too far, the Valley News sharing things about its own struggles, in a sense, its own workings, its own decisions, I personally have found that very helpful.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially with that transition to the printing,
To the
people
press.
losing their jobs. And
Right.
I have just a short thing. One is a question, one's an admiration, and one's a small tease.
In which order?
In which order would you like? The question is, in the real estate sales section, it seems that Lyme hardly ever shows up, and I think we have, this is a very local question, concern. Are there what gets in there? Everything that transpires in Haverhill or their equivalent in Vermont?
Yep. My understanding is it's everything, but it's we contract with a vendor who provides that to us, and so if things are missing, we should follow up on it.
Thanks. I was curious about that. One thing I admire is the way the Valley News reports on suicides. You seem to follow the media guidelines. I don't know, and these came from the Surgeon General, I don't know, 20 years ago. And I won't go into them, but you seem to report on suicides that happen in the public. If they happen at home, they're not reported on. And this was very important in our family decades ago, and I appreciate that. Do you go over these with new reporters? Is this part of training?
Yeah, with those guidelines in particular, I don't know that we go over with new reporters, but I do. They come up whenever we are writing about something or considering whether to write about something, or at least I often bring them up and am talking to folks about them.
It's very difficult, and I think you do a good job. The tease is a phrase, a three-word phrase that isn't showing up very much anymore, but it is former Lyme resident. Does this ring a bell with anybody? I think skiing. I'm glad it doesn't show up quite so much
I
anymore.
can't promise that it'll never show up again, but
Goodness sakes, you only lived here for a couple of years.
thank you very much, Michael. All right, I think that's it. So thank you all. I'm going to be hanging around for a little bit longer, and if anybody wants to do my goofy exercise where you try to fill in the front page, certainly feel free. I'm very interested to see how people would fill in the front page. I also have a little sign-up sheet, just if you want to keep in touch. I'm not giving your phone number to our advertising team or anything like that. But you know, folks who came to Queechee, one of them was actually at the Valley News this morning. She just wanted to see, you know, what does the newsroom look like, and the answer was not much, but you're welcome to come and take a look and see what we do. So if you want to leave your contact information for that, or just to keep in touch, certainly feel free. You can also mark a box to sign up for our daily newsletter, which has our headlines and things like that. And just let me know what you think. So thank you very much for taking time out of your weeks. I appreciate it.